Why you feel guilty spending money on yourself. Carl Jung observed that the mind keeps a second set of books, a ledger, nobody elected, tucked behind the one you use at the register, and it does not calculate in dollars, it calculates in old debts you never agreed to owe. Jung wrote in Ion, quote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate," end quote. And he would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? That tightening in your chest when you reach for something good for yourself is not a verdict handed down by some higher moral court. It is an old unmade decision rising up through the floor of your mind and steering your hand before your reasoning even arrives at the counter. And if you have ever put something back on the shelf you could easily afford, ever felt your stomach clench paying for a haircut, or a massage, or a coat that actually fits, you are not being frugal, and you are not being humble. You are being quietly haunted by something that was never once brought into the light of your own attention." So here is where we begin. 3 small admissions, said only to yourself. I no longer assume the guilt is telling me the truth about the purchase. I no longer mistake an old family rule for a law written into the universe. And the third one carries the real weight. So say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slower this time, I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of seeing has been useful to you tonight, consider staying close so that tomorrow's teaching can find you the same way this one did. And if something in what I just said made you go quiet for a second, made you think of the exact purchase you talked yourself out of last week, type the 2 words, "face it," in the comments below. Just those 2 words. Let them be your small seal on this hour. The first key is this. The guilt you feel is not about the money. It is about the size of the reaction compared to the size of the purchase. And that gap is the tell. Jung spent years studying exactly this kind of gap in his word association experiments. Watching a person's hand slow down, their breath catch, their answer stall, all triggered by an ordinary word that should have meant nothing. And he wrote of the discovery plainly. Complexes can have us. That is the phrase. Not we have complexes the way we have a coat we can take off, but complexes can have us, meaning a whole splinter of the psyche, a small autonomous knot of memory and feeling, can seize the wheel for a moment and drive the reaction, while the rest of you simply watches from the back seat, wondering why you suddenly feel like a criminal buying a candle. Think about your own last week. Was there a purchase, small, reasonable, well within your means, that still made your jaw tighten, that made you rehearse a justification to nobody, that made you check the price twice, as if the number itself might change if you looked hard enough? Imagine standing in line at a bookstore, a single book in your hand, nothing extravagant, and yet you find yourself doing quiet arithmetic that has nothing to do with your actual balance, counting not dollars but worthiness, wondering if today is a day you have somehow earned the right to want something. That arithmetic is not financial, no accountant taught it to you, and no bank statement demands it. It arrived from somewhere else entirely, and it keeps operating long after the original lesson has been forgotten. Notice too how the feeling behaves like weather rather than like thought. It rolls in suddenly. It does not wait for permission. It does not consult your actual income or your actual need. A thought can be reasoned with. A weather system cannot. And that is precisely the signal that you are not dealing with a conclusion you once reached. You are dealing with a reaction installed long before reasoning was even available to you. That rehearsal, that checking, that is not thrift. Thrift is quiet. This was loud. This was a complex speaking louder than your actual bank balance. And once you can name the gap between the size of the spend and the size of the feeling, you have already done the hardest part. Because a feeling that is disproportionate to its object is not describing the object anymore. It is describing an old wound, wearing the object as a costume. So this week, before you decide the guilt is wisdom, ask only one question. Is this reaction the size of this purchase? And let that question alone begin to loosen the grip. I will not let a disproportionate feeling pass itself off as an accurate account. The second key is this. That gap did not appear the day you swiped your card. It was built years earlier, in a house you did not choose, Imagine a child watching a parent's face tighten every single time a bill arrived, watching thrift get spoken of the way other households spoke of virtue, watching a parent forego something small for themselves and call it responsibility. That child does not conclude, "My parent is anxious about money." That child concludes, "Wanting things for myself is dangerous," and concludes it long before language can argue back. And that conclusion does not stay a memory. It becomes a splinter psyche, a small separate personality inside the larger one, complete with its own voice, its own certainty, its own timing. And it waits, patiently, for decades if it has to, for the exact moment you reach for something that is only for you, because that is its trigger word, that is its stimulus, spending on yourself specifically, not spending in general. Notice that most people with this complex can spend freely on a partner, a child, a friend, even a stranger's fundraiser, without a flicker of guilt. The guilt appears only at the border of the self, which tells you the complex is not actually about frugality at all. A truly frugal person is frugal everywhere. This person is frugal only at one very specific door, the door marked for me, and that specificity is the fingerprint. It proves this is not a value you hold. It is a complex you carry. Values are consistent. Complexes are selective. They defend one particular room in the house and leave every other room unguarded. Think of two siblings raised under the very same roof. One grows up able to buy a new coat without a second thought. The other feels a small electric jolt of shame, reaching for the exact same coat. Same parents, same table, same bills spread out under the same lamp, and yet two completely different ledgers formed, because the complex does not attach to the household in general, it attaches to one particular scene, one particular remark, one particular look on one particular evening, that the conscious mind may have long since forgotten, while the unconscious kept perfect record. That is why reasoning your way out of the guilt so rarely works. You can recite your own income, your own math, your own plain entitlement to a warm coat, and still feel the old current pulling underneath the argument, because you are arguing with your intellect against something that was never lodged in your intellect to begin with. It was lodged in a feeling, in an atmosphere, in the tightening of a parent's jaw at a kitchen table decades ago. So look at your own selectivity. Where does the guilt never show up, and where does it show up every single time? That asymmetry is the shape of the old room being defended. And once you can see the shape, you are no longer simply feeling the guilt. You are finally looking at it. I will notice where my guilt is selective, and let that selection speak the truth. The third key is this, and it needs a story to land properly. Jung documented a case from his early work with the word association test. A young man was asked to respond quickly to a list of ordinary words, and the test measured his response time with a stopwatch. Most words came back instantly: cup, table, river, window, answered without a flicker of hesitation, the mind simply handing them over the way you hand over your name. But a small cluster of words, money among them, produced a strange delay, a stumble, a wrong answer corrected too fast, and Jung followed that delay the way a tracker follows a broken twig. Because a delay like that is never random. It marks the exact spot where a complex has been touched. The stopwatch does not lie the way the conscious mind can lie to itself. A person can insist they feel nothing at all about a subject, and the stopwatch will quietly disagree. 0.3 of a second here, half a second there. Small numbers that add up to a very large confession. And in that particular case, the delay eventually led to a real one. The young man had taken 70 francs that were not his, and had built an entire structure of forgetting around it, so complete that the theft itself no longer lived in ordinary memory. He could have told you honestly that he did not remember it, and believed himself while saying so, but the complex around it still fired instantly whenever the stimulus word came near, still tightened his throat, still slowed his hand, because a complex does not need your permission to remember. It keeps its own records in its own vault, sealed off from the very mind that carries it. Now here is why this matters for you tonight. Your hesitation at the register is your own stopwatch moment. That is the delay Jung would have circled in red, Not because you stole anything, nothing so dramatic, but because something old and unspoken is still wired to that exact stimulus, spending on yourself, and it fires before your reasoning can even get a vote. Picture it plainly. You are standing in a shop. The coat fits, the price is fair, your account can bear it without strain, and still your hand hovers half a second longer than it should. Still a small internal committee convenes before you can lift your card. That half second is not caution. Caution is calm. This is something else entirely. This is the mind quietly checking a ledger you did not write and cannot read. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that an unmade decision happens outside. As fate, the popular paraphrase you may have heard is you will call it fate. And it is only a paraphrase, but it captures the mechanism honestly. What is not brought into consciousness does not disappear. It simply relocates. It moves from being a thought you could examine in daylight into being a compulsion you experience as just how you are. A kind of weather that seems to arrive from nowhere. So the guilt feels like character, like humility, like being a sensible person, when it is actually a complex operating exactly the way complexes operate, autonomously, quietly, and with perfect timing, always arriving a half second before the reasoning mind, so that by the time you notice the feeling, it has already dressed itself up as your own considered opinion. Think of it this way. If someone timed your own responses the way Jung timed his patients, cup would come back instantly, weather would come back instantly, but the word treat, or the phrase for myself, would very likely come back slower, with a small catch in it, a tiny stall you have felt 100 times, and simply called being careful with money. The exercise for this key is simple. The next time you feel that stall before a purchase, do not push through it in defiance, and do not obey it either. Just pause, and notice the delay itself, the way Jung noticed the stumble over the stimulus word. Ask what this purchase touched, not what it cost, and let the answer come slowly, because the complex will not explain itself to a rushed question. It only speaks to patience. I will treat my hesitation as information, not as instruction. The fourth key is this, and here the lens turns, because up to now we have been talking about people like this: a young man in an old case file, a child in a house you never lived in, but now walk your own ordinary week with me. Slowly, the way you would walk a crime scene looking for the one footprint that does not match the rest. Take an ordinary Tuesday, morning coffee bought without a flicker, because it is small and habitual, and does not feel like it belongs to you specifically. Mid-morning, a coworker mentions they are short for lunch, and you cover it without a second thought, because covering someone else feels generous rather than indulgent. Early afternoon, a browser tab sits open on a pair of shoes you actually need. The old ones cracked at the sole for weeks now, and that tab gets closed and reopened 3 separate times before evening, each time with a different silent argument about whether you have earned it. Then finally, at 11 at night, you buy them. Quietly, almost apologetically, already composing in your head what you would say if someone asked why you spent that. Same day, same person, same account, same reasonable sum of money, and yet 3 entirely different emotional weather systems moving through you, depending on whether the money was headed toward someone else or toward yourself. Now take it further. Think of a Saturday. Running errands. You buy a birthday gift for a friend without checking the price twice. You buy a coffee for a stranger ahead of you in line just to feel generous. And then you stand in front of a rack of your own clothes, needing a coat, actually needing one, and you feel your hand hover, unwilling, as though reaching for it required permission from someone who is not even in the room. This is the exercise, so pause for a moment right now and pick one real purchase from the last 2 weeks that produced guilt out of proportion to its cost, something small enough that the price was never really the issue, and ask 3 plain questions. 1. What did I almost not buy? 2. What did I tell myself instead? And 3. Whose voice did that telling actually sound like, not whose face? Because by now the voice is rarely attached to one person, it has become composite, inherited, worn smooth by years of use, but the tone underneath it is almost always recognizable the moment you listen for it. Tight, clipped, a little moralizing, as if spending on yourself required a defense prepared in advance. And once you can hear that tone clearly, separate from your own actual voice, you have done more real work in 5 quiet minutes than most people do in years of simply obeying it without ever once turning around to see who was speaking. I will audit one guilty purchase honestly this week. If this key is starting to feel personal rather than theoretical, that is exactly the sign you are close to something worth staying with. So consider staying subscribed, because the deeper keys always come after the ones that sting a little. The 5th key is the deepest one, and it unfolds in 3 pieces, so take them slowly, because this is the key that finally explains the whole shape of the guilt rather than just its trigger. First, consider what the complex is actually protecting, because a complex this stubborn is rarely just cruelty toward you. It is usually loyalty wearing cruelty as a disguise. Imagine a household where a parent quietly sacrificed comfort for years so the children could have more. That parent may never have said a word about it. The sacrifice may never have been named out loud even once at the dinner table. But the atmosphere carried the lesson anyway. Self-denial is love, and a child raised in that atmosphere does not simply admire the sacrifice from a safe distance. They absorb it as an identity, the way a plant absorbs the mineral content of the soil it happens to grow in, without ever choosing the soil, so that decades later, spending freely on themselves does not feel like a neutral transaction at a register. It feels like a small betrayal of the person who went without. And here is the part worth sitting with a moment longer. The guilt in this light is not punishment. It is a strange, twisted form of devotion, an old debt of loyalty being paid on a schedule nobody ever consciously set. Imagine, for a moment, a grown man standing in a shoe store, holding a perfectly reasonable pair of boots he genuinely needs for winter, and feeling, out of nowhere, a wave of something close to shame. Not because the boots are extravagant, they are not, but because some old ledger inside him is quietly totaling up every winter his parent went without new boots so that he could have them. He is not being greedy in that moment. He is unknowingly trying to stay loyal to a sacrifice he never asked anyone to make. And that is a very different thing to untangle than simple vanity or simple thrift. It means the guilt is not evidence that you are selfish. It is evidence that you once loved someone very much and never found a clean way to stop proving it. And notice how this loyalty hides itself in the smallest gestures. Imagine a woman standing at her own birthday dinner, ordering the cheapest thing on the menu out of habit, while the same evening she would have ordered anything for a friend celebrating beside her without a flicker of hesitation. She is not thinking of her parents in that moment. She has probably not thought of them all day, and yet the old atmosphere is there anyway, folded quietly into her hand as she orders. Because a complex does not need to be remembered consciously to keep working. It only needs the original scene to have happened once, deeply enough, at an age when the mind had no defenses against it yet. Second, consider the double standard we already named earlier tonight, and look at it once more, but harder this time. Notice that you extend to strangers, to friends, to co-workers you barely know, a generosity you refuse to extend to yourself. Notice that if a friend described your exact situation back to you, the same income, the same reasonable purchase, the same hesitation standing at the same counter, you would tell them without a second's pause, of course you can have that. You would not lecture them about discipline. You would not ask them to justify the expense line by line. And yet you cannot say the same sentence to yourself with anything close to that ease. Jung wrote of the persona, the mask negotiated with the world. And there is a persona quietly at work here too, the mask of the person who does not need much, the low-maintenance one, the reliable one, the one who is easy to love because they ask for almost nothing, and that mask gets applauded, quietly, consistently, by nearly everyone around you. Your friends praise your restraint, your family relies on your steadiness, and that praise, however well meant, makes the mask very hard to put down. Because putting it down risks disappointing the very people whose approval helped build it in the first place. Think of how strange this actually is when you say it plainly. You have built an entire reputation, an entire identity, around never quite letting yourself have things, and that reputation now guards the very door it was supposed to protect you from noticing. The mask has become the jailer, and it is a gentle jailer. It never shouts. It simply nods approvingly every time you put something back on the shelf. And that quiet approval feels so much like virtue that you rarely think to ask whether it is virtue at all, or simply an old arrangement nobody has renegotiated since childhood. Third, consider what actually happens once this is made conscious. Not fixed, not solved in a single evening, simply seen clearly for what it is. Because Jung was careful never to promise a cure for this particular ache. He promised only that consciousness changes the terms of the negotiation. Once you can name the complex, once you can say quietly to yourself, "This guilt belongs to an old loyalty. It does not belong to today's arithmetic," you gain something you did not have a moment before. A small half-second of space opening up between the trigger and the reaction. And in that half-second, for maybe the first time in years, the ego actually gets a vote in the matter, not a rebellion. Not a defiant spending spree meant to prove a point to nobody in particular. That would only be the same complex wearing a slightly different costume and calling it freedom, but a real choice, made slowly, with your eyes open and your reasoning finally present in the room. Sometimes, weighing the facts honestly, you will still decide not to buy the thing, and that is entirely fine. Sometimes you will buy it, and that is fine as well. The point was never really the purchase itself. The point was only ever this: who is making the decision? The old splinter psyche running on inherited fear from a house you did not choose, or you, awake, present, weighing the actual facts of your actual life today. Picture that same woman at her own birthday table a year later, ordering what she actually wants. Not defiantly, not to prove anything to the empty chair across from her, simply because she noticed the old habit arriving and let it pass through without obeying it. That is the entire difference between being quietly lived by a complex and finally living your own life on your own terms. I will let today's facts decide, not yesterday's fear. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is simply this: none of this teaching is an argument for carelessness. Jung was never in the business of telling people to spend without thought. The goal was never license. The goal was choice. And those two words look similar from a distance, but they are almost opposites up close. License says, spend and silence the guilt by force. Choice says, understand the guilt and then decide anyway, or decide otherwise. Either way, with your eyes open, a person who has made this complex conscious does not necessarily spend more. They simply spend differently, with less noise in the transaction, less rehearsed apology, less silent negotiation, with a parent who may not even know this negotiation is happening inside you 30 years later. Imagine two people buying the exact same coat on the exact same afternoon. One buys it in a hurry, almost furtively, already composing a justification for no one in particular, checking the receipt twice, mentioning the price unprompted to a friend later as if preempting a verdict. The other buys it slowly, tries it on without apology, decides it fits both the coat and the life, and walks out with the same coat and a completely different nervous system. Notice, the coat did not change, the money did not change, only the presence or absence of an old unseen tribunal changed. And that is the entire difference this work offers. Not a bigger budget, not permission, a quieter mind, and quiet minds, oddly enough, tend to spend more wisely than guilty ones. Because guilt makes poor financial decisions too. Think of the person who denies themselves small, honest pleasures for months, a coffee, a book, a proper pair of shoes, and then breaks that long famine with one large, reckless purchase that does more damage than the small ones ever would have. The guilty spender is often not the careful one people assume. They are simply postponing the spending into a single explosive moment, trying to silence a persistent ache with one loud gesture instead of many small, quiet, honest ones. That is not discipline. That is a debt-collecting interest. So this final key is really an invitation to trust the process you have just walked through. Notice the gap between the feeling and the price. Trace its origin back to a house you did not choose. Hear its selective voice at that one specific door. Audit one real purchase this week without flinching. Understand the loyalty quietly buried underneath it, and then simply let the decision be yours again, quietly, without ceremony, without a speech, without needing to prove anything to a ledger nobody elected. Some days you will still choose to save the money, and that will be a real choice, not an old fear wearing a disguise. And some days you will choose to spend it, and that too will be real, made in daylight, by you. The measure was never how much you spend. The measure was always who is standing at the register when the decision gets made. I will spend from choice, not from an old and unspoken debt. Here is the whole picture. The guilt was never about the price tag. It was a complex, a splinter of the psyche defending one very specific door, while leaving every other door of your generosity wide open. It was built in a house where self-denial looked like love. It announces itself through a delay, a stall, a stomach that tightens faster than your reasoning can arrive. It shows itself most clearly in the small asymmetry between how easily you give to others and how hard you fight yourself to receive. And it loosens, not through force, but through being seen plainly, named honestly, and finally handed back to a mind that is finally awake enough to choose. All 6 keys were never 6 separate ideas. They were 6 turns of the same single key. The recognition that what feels like your personality at the checkout counter is very often an old, unspoken loyalty, still running its errand through your hands. So the next time you feel that familiar tightening, reaching for something plainly good for yourself, pause there for just a moment and ask, gently, whose voice is this really? And notice, softly, that you now have a name for what is happening. And a name is where freedom always quietly begins. I make the unconscious conscious, and I wonder, the next time your hand hesitates over something good for you, will you finally recognize whose hand is actually pulling back?